We've been given new evidence from a charity showing horrific cases of hate crime against Muslims. But who's to blame? In a week when our papers are filled with stories of alleged Islamist terrorism, we ask, is the media stirring up hatred against Muslims? A report from a helpline claims Muslims, particularly women, are being attacked and abused on our streets. Is this pure and simple racism, or is the media stoking Islamophobia? The helpline Tell Mama claims Muslims, particularly women, are being spat on, urinated on and violently assaulted just because of their faith. One woman even had dog feces smeared on her headscarf. What is the cause of these attacks? Is it down to a lack of integration by Muslims, or is the media fueling hatred against them? This weekend marks the anniversary of the July the 7th terrorist attacks that shook London. They triggered a wave of anti-Muslim feeling around the UK. But 7 years on, has anything changed? Figures to be officially released tomorrow by a government-backed helpline, Tell Mama, suggest regular violent harassment of Muslims is taking place. The helpline recorded 140 serious attacks in the last 5 months, 3/4 against women, ranging from online abuse to physical violence, such as pulling off veils. They say a third of the attacks were carried out by supporters of the BNP or EDL. So what is fueling these attacks? Many Muslim organisations point the finger at the media. They say Muslims as a group are only seen in a negative light, with the papers full of stories about potential terrorist plots. And Muslims say this stirs up violence and hatred against them. But most journalists say they are only reporting the facts, and they're not responsible for the actions of a few racists. Many politicians are concerned about Muslim segregation in some parts of Britain. Could that be leading to resentment and violence? So is our media to blame for encouraging Islamophobia? Or is that just an excuse for mindless racism? Mohammed, it is just a few mindless racists, isn't it? I mean, it's not the media's fault.
No, I think the media have got a huge responsibility when it comes to reporting these issues. You talk about facts, it's not about facts. If you look at the Mumbai terrorist attacks in 2008, we heard every single newspaper in the aftermath, the day after, reporting that British Muslims were involved. Less than 10 hours later, it was the other way. There was no single British Muslim involved. No apologies, no retractions, and the whole community demonised. The media have got a huge role to play, and I think they've got a responsible position on this.
Okay, well, that is the question from
newspapers are always making mistakes, but when people say, I blame the media for all of this, it's such an easy excuse. There's also a misunderstanding of the nature of newspapers and news stories. They are about what is unusual. What happens most of the time in London, I live in inner London, is there are Muslim shopkeepers, and no problem at all, because we don't then report, well, the vast majority of Muslims in this country go about their lives not getting on anybody's nerves. All they're doing is what their non-Muslim friends and neighbours, and indeed, you know, people go and buy things from their shops.
Well, Mohammed, take that on specifically. That's news is the
yes,
unusual.
What is unusual?
The moral, ethical question is: should journalists be reporting facts? I mean, you refer to that in your open piece.
Yes, okay.
Well, I wouldn't class that as a mistake. If you look at the newspaper headlines today about the 14 arrests we've had over the last few days, we've had 3 or 4 different versions in 3 or 4 different newspapers. So there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot, in some cases, making it up, and that's not good.
Right.
And when you see terrorist suspects who are arrested and then released without charge, there's a huge impact on community relations. And all I'm saying is, I work as a journalist. I'm involved in the media, and sometimes it's too easy to blame the media. But if you read the Mail, for example, there seems to be an anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim story pretty much every single day in the newspapers.
Well,
the Daily Star's the same.
I want to bring in Simon here, because terrorism is news at the moment. And what do you make of the argument, well, those terrorist suspects happen to be Muslim, and that's, as Anne says, the legitimate reason for speculation?
The terrorism is news at the moment. Most people are aware that only a small minority of Muslims are sympathetic to terrorism, and as Anne says, the news reports things that are unusual. However, I do think that while the blame for racist attacks lies with the racists who commit them primarily, nonetheless the media have to behave responsibly. And what we do see is some papers, not all the media, but some papers turn stories into Muslim stories when they're not about Islam. So to give you an example, a couple of years ago, it had been a local news story originally about a swimming pool where, because of a lack of frosted glass on the bottom screens, a few people had complained, particularly women customers at the swimming pool, that people were sort of standing outside and looking in at them in their bathing costumes. And some of the people who'd complained happened to be Muslim, not all of them at all. A couple of newspapers ran this story.
I don't think the Mail did.
I don't think it was.
But the papers picked it out as a Muslim's complaint.
As Muslims demand that lights be turned off in swimming pool, Muslims demand that a swim in darkness. It was nothing to do with Islam. The facts are exaggerated. Because Islam is in the news, it's a convenient scapegoat.
But who put Islam in the news?
Exactly. I mean, I
it was put into the news by the extremists.
Well, I see this is the problem. There's a slippery slope.
Are you not supposed to report arrests because it upsets Muslims?
What I'm saying to you, Samir, is I'm opposed to terrorism. I've been campaigning, and as thousands of Muslim organisations in this country, against terrorism and extremism. The headlines in your newspaper, for example, the Mail, and the Star, and some of the other right-wing newspapers, has been an anti-Muslim story. So if it's not halal meat, it's the way women dress. If it's not the way women dress, it's Muslims want to do away with Christmas.
Well, let's get into integration in a minute, because I think it's on the phone. It's Fiaz Mughal from the Tell Mama helpline. Now, this is the charity that you did research on quite nasty attacks on Muslims, which we mentioned at the top of the programme. You found a significant number of these attacks are on women, and they're carried out by men, often who have connections to supporting the BNP or EDL. Is that right?
That's right, indeed, and thank you for having me on this morning. Our report has found that of the 170 cases to date, and we've been running since March of this year, that the majority of the attacks are against Muslim females. Over 70% of the callers are Muslim female, and that in fact the majority also of those numbers wear the hijab, so they're visibly female. We also found that those women who wear the niqab and the hijab, i.e. the face veil as well as the head covering, are more likely to have repeat attacks and more aggressive attacks, and that the individuals carrying out these attacks are mainly young white males aged between 20 to 50 with an online presence, because we also look at online issues, with an online presence, having a large number, disproportionate number of EDL sympathisers who are spouting a great deal of anti-Muslim rhetoric and hate.
Fiaz, briefly, do you think there's a direct connection between these kinds of attacks and media reporting?
Absolutely. I mean, you just look at the Rochdale incident and you look at the online activity of EDL, for example, EDL sympathisers, and it is, they are saying things like paedophile Muslims. And this is constant. It spikes when there are incidences nationally or internationally.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, okay.
Violence against women is all over the world. It's not always.
Your newspaper doesn't feel the need to print these stories. When women are attacked in the streets, verbally abused. Yet they're very quick to print anti-Muslim stories. I mean, this is the problem from an ethical and a moral point of view that I base my argument on. Is that we've got to, these women, and I've met some of these victims across the country who've been spat at and been verbally abused, and we would just like to see the same anger and frustration from politicians.
One of the main problems is that you have a terrorist and to a certain extent I have sympathy. The niqab is in itself, I'm afraid, an aggressive act. It says, I want
nothing
to do with your society. Now, I know that my society is pretty awful in many ways, but it says no.
It's extremely difficult to sit next to a woman, a very successful woman, who tries to, criticise the right of women to choose how they dress.
Well, my God, Islam is full of that.
Well, it is, absolutely, and I agree with you. But there's a difference between pressurised and when people are going out on the streets and spitting at women who wear the niqab, pulling these niqabs off and putting excrement on their faces.
I mean, that's what's happening. It's just an excuse by thugs who might be doing other crimes to other women.
If you listen to what Anne says on her third point, it tells you that it's a bit more than endorsement of that.
Islam is a religion, it's not a race, and obviously if people have got issues in this way, behaving in this way, with members of the community. We wouldn't support that, we wouldn't encourage it, we wouldn't endorse it. In the British National Party, we are in for educating the public about the true nature of Islam and organising proper and legitimate political opposition to the Islamification of Britain.
I mean, Robert has this narrow-minded view about, at least, the majority of attacks that are being carried out by sympathisers within his party. It's a fascist, racist ideology that violates human dignity, and Mr. West is a shining example of that. We've got to be very careful in how we deal with these issues. I'm not one, I'm a believer in freedom of speech in a liberal democracy, and we've got to have a good debate, but you know, endorsing the abuse of women is just not acceptable.
Robert isn't saying that.
He's putting a PR spin on it, not, you know, totally disassociating himself from that, but the actions speak louder than words.
I just want to bring in another contributor. We have someone who's been a victim of one of these attacks, Nur Jahan Khatun. What happened to you?
Hi, morning. Thanks for having me on. What happened to me a good few years ago now was I was walking home one evening, early evening, around 5 o'clock, and I've noticed a group of young white men, ranging between 8 to 9 of them actually. They rushed towards me and pushed me down onto the floor. Now, while they were doing this, they were screaming out Bin Laden, scum, and other verbal, quite abusive words at me. Now, because they were a lot taller than me, they pushed me to the ground. While I fell to the ground, I kept feeling my hijab, my headscarf being pulled, my burqa being pulled, and I was being kicked, I was being punched. So what felt like a lifetime that was going on, a few minutes later, these white young men, I felt something was being poured over me from a couple of various sources, some sort of liquid or fluid. I realised later on when it splashed into my mouth that I was actually being urinated on. So I felt physically 3 sources of urination coming towards me. Now, towards the end of this attack, something was being rubbed by my face by 2 hands. Now, whether that was 1 person or 2 person, I don't recall, because I was trying to protect my head by covering my head with my arms while I was screaming for help. Now, while this was happening, I kept thinking, what on earth is it that they're rubbing into my face? I never would ever believe that I had dog feces actually being rubbed in my face.
I'm so sorry. What did the police say? Did they treat this as a racist attack, or did they say it was Islamophobic?
Well, they classified it as a race attack. Clearly it wasn't, because of the words that they were using, some which I cannot repeat on air. It's very clearly that it was an anti-Muslim prejudice attack. I've actually had, I'm presuming, the same group of white men who were shouting and throwing stones at me weeks leading up to that in the area that I was living at that time.
I'm sorry.
So it was very clear there was anti-Muslim. It was very clear that my hijab was being pulled off and the burqa was being ripped off.
Nur Jahan, thank you very much for coming on and sharing that story with us. I mean, it is an appalling tale, Anne, and you can see why for women like
all
her,
attacks like that are appalling.
They feel there's a connection to a wider picture.
It seems to me that if you wear a burqa or a niqab, you can't see any face. It makes people slightly alarmed because they think these people
I think you've made that point, Anne.
I think we've got
because we're running out of time.
She was not wearing a burqa, she was wearing a hijab. But whatever she was wearing, the attack was disgusting. Of course it was. I don't think any newspaper would say, oh, wonderful, stick up for white men attacking.
I'm sure we see these stories in the newspapers. We don't see these stories. We don't. With respect, we don't. And if it was you know, an anti-Muslim story, then it would be front page news on the Daily Mail in particular.
I do want to let Robert West of the BNP respond on this. What do you say to Nur Jahan, who recounted that appalling attack on her?
Well, obviously we're not in favour of crime.
Would you condemn it?
No, of course not. We would condemn.
You would condemn the crime.
Of course we would. I mean, the problem of Islam has to be dealt with politically, rather than in the way that certain members of the EDL or certain people who have various views, who have seen the danger of Islam, but they're not reacting to it in the appropriate political way that they should.
Robert, thank you very much. Is there an issue here about politicians, actually? Was it politically correct to not talk about crimes and issues about integration? And, I mean, Rochdale is a great example of it. People felt a problem was ignored because no one wanted to stir up sensitivities in Muslims.
But I think you are right. We've got to, if you look at integration, we've had an opinion poll, a report only in the last few days. Muslims are more integrated, more passionate, more patient patriotic, more British than their white counterparts. So I think celebrating our differences is something which is good, but we've got to be strong in holding values that bind us together.